Today, we are dissecting a high-stakes conflict that sits right at the heart of language learning and maybe, just maybe, at the heart of how we present ourselves to the world. We're looking at a specific conflict, the clash between performing fluency and telling the truth.
And our source material for this is a Band 6.5 IELTS speaking test. It features a candidate from Nepal, and it's analyzed with this really rigorous, almost surgical breakdown from an expert examiner.
It really is. And this isn't just some dry academic exercise about passing a test. This material, it really exposes a fundamental paradox in how we measure communication.
Exactly. We're looking at the tension between what the examiner calls strategic simplification, which is, essentially gaming the test to minimize error. And on the other hand, authentic expression, which is the student's very human, very messy desire to convey the complex reality of her life and her culture.
Right, so the central question we're tackling today is this. In a standardized language test, is your goal to communicate reality, or is your goal to reduce cognitive load to ensure technical precision? I'm arguing the examiner's position. The source material proves that a speaking test is a performance of technical skill, not a knowledge dump. Success comes from narrowing your focus, deliberately ignoring the complexity of the truth, and prioritizing that delivery system, the grammar and vocabulary.
And I'm arguing for the student's instinct. Language is a tool for describing the world as it actually is. And if a test penalizes a student for trying to capture the diversity of our country, describing Nepal as a place of both mountains and temples, then I think the standard itself is flawed. It creates this robotic environment that actively punishes intellectual ambition.
A bold claim to start us off. But let's look at the hard data first. This student received a band 6.5. Now, for our listeners who might not be IELTS examiners, that's classified as a competent user. It's a good score. I mean, it gets you into many universities, but it isn't a great score. She hit a ceiling.
Mm-hmm.
And the examiner's critique diagnoses exactly why. She was trying to be an encyclopedia instead of a speaker. His core advice is, it's a mantra that every language learner needs to hear. It is a speaking test, not a knowledge test.
See, that phrase sounds perfectly logical on the surface. It's not a knowledge test. But I really want to unpack the damage it does to the actual conversation. It effectively tells the student that their knowledge is a liability.
It's not damage, it's calibration. The student made her task, impossible by trying to list every single aspect of her country in part 1. When she was asked about tourist attractions, she didn't just pick one. She felt this compulsion to list Mount Everest, the birthplace of Gautama Buddha, the Pashupathat Temple, and the nature sites. She was mentally compiling a travel brochure in real time.
But isn't that what a conversation is? If you ask me right now, tell me about the United States, and I only mention the Grand Canyon, I'd be giving you a false picture. If my country has the highest peak in the world and the birthplace of the Buddha, surely it's dishonest to only mention one. She was trying to give the examiner the full context of her home.
But it's not about honesty. It's about processing power. This is the first key insight from the material, the listing trap. The examiner points out that this habit of listing forces the brain to retrieve factual data. She's searching her memory for the specific English names of temples, the specific geography of Everest. That retrieval process consumes RAM in the brain. Processing power that should be allocated to grammar structures, tense consistency, and pronunciation.
So you're saying she sacrificed form for content?
Precisely. By trying to be comprehensive, she forced herself into a series of pauses and hesitations while her brain hunted for facts. And those hesitations are what capped her fluency and coherence score. She traded a higher band score for factual accuracy. It's just a bad trade.
I strongly disagree with the premise that listing is inherently a bad trade. I think her approach was intellectually honest and, frankly, it demonstrated a different kind of skill. When she was asked about attractions, she provided a survey of the landscape. She gave us the religious context with Lord Shiva, the geographical context with Everest, and the historical context with Buddha. That requires a broad vocabulary.
But did it require a deep vocabulary? Let's look closer at the transcript.
Well, she used terms like cultural heritage site. She described the people as hospitable. She talked about food being marinated.
but the listing structure itself is grammatically repetitive. There is X, and also there is Y, and we have Z. It just traps the speaker in noun-heavy enumeration. You aren't showing off complex sentence structures. You're just naming things. The examiner's point, and I think this is brilliant, is that depth creates flow, while breadth kills it.
Explain that distinction. How does depth create flow?
Okay, let's look at the segment on cooking momos. This was the one moment where she actually followed the strategy the examiner wants, maybe instinctively. She stopped trying to list 5 different Nepali dishes and just zoomed in on one, the dumpling.
Ah, the momos. That was a vivid description. I actually got hungry listening to it.
Right. It was vivid because she went deep. Because she focused on one single object, her brain was free to access descriptive verbs and adverbs. She talked about steaming, covering with chicken, marinated, sauté with butter, frying. She built a process. And the grammar became complex sequencing, passives, adjectives, naturally because she wasn't jumping from topic to topic.
That is a fair point regarding the momos. The culinary description had a rhythm that the list of temples lacked. I'll give you that.
Exactly. The examiner's insight is that our brains find it easier to describe one thing in high detail than to categorize 20 things. That isn't stifling creativity, it is enabling grammatical complexity. If she had applied that Momo strategy to the tourist sites, just picking one temple and describing the smell of the incense, the monkeys, the architecture, she would have scored a band 7 or 8.
Okay, I can concede on the dumplings, but I think this simplification argument falls apart and actually becomes dangerous when we move to more abstract topics. Let's look at this segment on the holiday industry and pollution. This is where the examiner's advice, it actually made me cringe a little.
You mean the resort abstraction strategy?
Yes. The student was trying to grapple with a very real, complex issue. She was discussing the tension between the economic benefits of tourism, revenue generation, and the negative environmental impacts, like waste and air pollution. She was trying to weigh these opposing forces. That is a sophisticated cognitive task.
It is, and she stumbled through it. She lost her grammar.
Because it's a hard topic, but look at the examiner's feedback. He suggested that if she gets stuck, she should just think of a generic resort or a made-up story to make it easier. He literally said, is there a resort? Does that have any impact on the environment? He wants her to fabricate a simple scenario rather than analyze the actual economy.
And I support that tactic 100%. This is the second key insight. Concrete anchors defeat abstract paralysis. The examiner explicitly states, human beings find it easier to talk about stories and examples than to think about these abstract concepts. And he's right. When you are under pressure in an exam, trying to formulate a sociological thesis on the impact of tourism on a developing nation, that's a trap.
It's only a trap if you view the test as a minefield to be tiptoed through. The student mentioned that Nepal is a developing country and the tourists want to see how it is different from their lifestyle. That is a profound observation. She talked about the undeveloped places and the different side of lives. She was engaging in sociology.
But she wasn't being graded on sociology. She was being graded on English. By trying to hold those big abstract concepts in her head, her grammar disintegrated. The examiner isn't asking for a lie, he's asking for a concrete anchor. If you tell a story about a specific resort where a car creates smoke, you can use narrative tenses, past simple, past continuous. You can say, I saw a car, it was smoking, the guests were coughing. That is clean, accurate English.
But it's so boring. It is C. Jane Run level discourse.
It's effective. If you talk about economic benefits versus pollution, you're stuck in abstract present tense, trying to balance complex conditional clauses like, if the economy grows, then the pollution might. That is high-risk behavior in a live exam.
But where's the soul in that? We are teaching students that it's better to tell a polished, generic anecdote about a resort than to struggle with the truth of their nation's development. That just feels like a betrayal of the purpose of language.
The purpose of the test is to prove you can construct sentences, not that you can solve the climate crisis.
Okay, let me give you a specific example where avoiding strategy actually produced the best moment in the test, the movie segment.
Where to?
Yes, she was asked about the last movie she saw. A strategic student, following your logic, would have picked a movie with a very simple plot to describe, maybe The Lion King. easy to explain, clear narrative arc, but she picked War 2, an action movie, and she gave this wonderfully honest answer. She admitted the story wasn't great, there is not much in the story to tell, but she watched it because of the actor, Hrithik Roshan.
I admit that was a charming moment. It broke the tension.
It was more than charming, it was pure engagement. She said, "He's kind of already old, but the way he maintained himself, you don't want to miss it." That is real communication. She wasn't filtering her thoughts through a strategy of what is easiest to describe. She was sharing a genuine human reaction. If she had followed the strategic simplification rule, she might have made up a story about a simple movie with a clear beginning, middle, and end. And we would have lost that spark of personality.
That's an interesting interpretation, though. I would frame it differently. I would argue that she was being strategic there, perhaps unconsciously. She focused on one aspect, the actor, and ignored the plot. That aligns perfectly with the examiner's advice. Pick one thing and go deep. She didn't try to explain the entire convoluted plot of the movie. She just talked about Hrithik Roshan. So, in a way, that moment supports my argument that narrowing the focus produces better speech.
I think you're retrofitting the strategy to fit the success. She spoke about him because she cared, not because it was tactically advantageous. She broke the fourth wall of the test and just talked to the guy like a human being.
Which is great. But let's see what happened when the interaction became more formal. Let's move to part 3, specifically the discussion on museums. This brings up the issue of handling the unknown.
This was the moment she asked for clarification, right?
Yes. The examiner asked a rather clunky question about what museums should do to become more popular. The student paused and explicitly asked, "I'm sorry, I didn't get the question. What should they do to make them more popular?" And the examiner praised this.
He did, and rightly so.
This aligns with my view that communication strategies like asking for help or rephrasing are valid high-level language skills. So many students think asking, "What do you mean?" lowers their score, but admitting you don't understand is significantly better than rambling off topic. It shows confidence and control.
I agree with you there, but I want to focus on her answer once she understood the question. She didn't go for the simple answer. She talked about using digital transitions to captivate the TikTok generation and creating content. She said, today's generation is mostly about digital things.
It was a surprisingly modern answer.
It was a sophisticated answer. It didn't fit the keep it simple mold. She was proposing a modernization strategy for museums involving social media and digital content. This proves the student can handle complexity. The limitation wasn't her language ability, it was the test format making her nervous. Which brings us to the notes.
The notes were a disaster. The examiner was very clear about this in the feedback. In part 2, she was looking down at her cue card constantly, looking at the page, then talking, then looking at the page.
She was trying to stay on track.
But the prop became a hindrance, and this is a crucial takeaway for anyone taking a speaking test. The notes are a trap. The examiner's point is that the notes are there to organize your thoughts before you speak. Once you start speaking, you need to ignore them and make eye contact. The listing habit we talked about earlier, that was exacerbated by the notes. She wrote a list, so she read a list. If she had written a single concept, Mamos, she would have spoken naturally.
I see that, but I have compassion for why she relied on the notes. She was trying to cover all the requirements. The cue card has bullet points. It asks, what is it? Where is it? Why do people go there? She felt a duty to address every bullet point. The strategy of ignore the notes and just chat feels incredibly risky to a student who thinks they will lose points for missing a prompt.
But that is exactly why the examiner's feedback is so liberating. He is telling her, you don't have to hit every bullet point mechanically. He says, start your answer with one thing and go deep. He is giving her permission to let go of the rigid structure. He's telling her that flow matters more than boxes checked.
Or permission to ignore the prompt's complexity. But let's look at one final area where I think the friction between strategy and soul is strongest, the concept of hospitality.
Treat your guests like God.
Yes, she brought this up multiple times. The God is in your house. It is a profound cultural concept in Nepal, Atithi Devo Bhava.
To her, you cannot explain Nepal without explaining this deep spiritual obligation to the guest. It defines the national character.
I acknowledge the beauty of the sentiment. However, from a testing perspective, she repeated it verbatim. She used the guests like God phrase in part 1 and again in part 2. In an IELTS test, exact repetition is a signal of a limited lexicon. It tells the examiner, I only have one way to express this idea.
See, this is where I get frustrated. To the examiner, repetition is a failure of vocabulary. To the student, repetition is a signal of emphasis. She is emphasizing the core value of her culture. She isn't repeating it because she can't think of another word. She is repeating it because it is the central thesis of Nepali life.
But the test cannot measure cultural sincerity. It measures lexical resource. A strategic student would make the point once, then move to a new grammatical structure or a synonym. Instead of repeating guests are God, they might say, we hold a deeply spiritual view of visitors, or hospitality is revered as a sacred duty.
That is easy for us to say as native speakers. But by demanding she paraphrase a sacred concept, we're asking her to dilute it. Guests are God is the direct translation of the Sanskrit. Changing it to hospitality as a sacred duty sounds more academic, sure, but it loses the raw power of the original sentiment. The test favors the academic paraphrase over the cultural truth.
And that is the reality of the beast. The IELTS is an academic English test. It favors academic precision. My position remains that the student needs to treat the exam as a game of delivery. The examiner offered downloadable PDF reports, lists of sentence structures, and strategic simplification for a reason. These are the tools to get a band 7 or 8. You cannot treat the exam like a documentary about Nepal.
And I suppose that is where we differ. While I admit the advice is practical, if she wants the score, she should follow it, I think we should mourn the loss of complexity. Her desire to discuss the different side of lives and the undeveloped places showed a mind ready for deep conversation.
But a mind that lacked the English tools to execute that deep conversation fluently.
Perhaps, but I would argue the test format terrified her out of her natural fluency. When she felt safe, like discussing the actors she loved, the fluency was there. The strategy of simplification feels like putting training wheels on a Ferrari. It keeps you safe, but it stops you from seeing what the engine can really do.
Training wheels prevent you from crashing. And in part 1, with the listing of heritage sites, she crashed, she stumbled, she hesitated. The strategy isn't about dumbing it down. It's about creating a safety net so your English can shine without the cognitive overload of being an encyclopedia.
I suppose my worry is that if she follows this advice too closely, she becomes a resort speaker, generic, polished, and completely interchangeable with any other student. The listing student, the one who wants to tell you about Buddha and Everest and Shiva, is the one I actually want to talk to.
Well, in the real world, you can talk to her for hours. But in the exam room, she has 14 minutes to prove she can control the language.
Touché.
So, looking at the examiner's final verdict, he praised her pronunciation and her general understanding. He's going to send her a full PDF report. He clearly wants her to succeed, and the path he lays out is pragmatic. Write notes, but don't read them. Pick one topic and go deep. Ask for clarification if you need it.
And my takeaway is that the student has a wonderful, raw ability to connect. Her answers about the TikTok generation and the War II movie prove she has modern, relevant thoughts. I just hope that in her pursuit of the perfect score, she doesn't lose that instinct to tell the whole truth about our country, even if it's messy.
It is a fascinating look under the hood of how English proficiency is measured. And it leaves us with a lingering question for our listeners. In a language test, is it better to be simple and flawless or complex and imperfect?
Or, to put it another way, should we teach students to pass the test or to tell the story?
That is all the time we have for today. Thank you for joining